I've gone ahead and cut 2 pieces of dot paper, one for the front, one for the back. And as I kind of went over with you earlier a little bit, your dot paper doesn't have to be as large as your entire piece of muslin, particularly if you picked one of the shorter skirt lengths. So as I look at my front here, and I did the kind of shortest possible length for the skirt, you can see my paper underneath, and you basically just want to even unfold the fabric. Imagine that your corner exists up here, and you could just measure how long from this corner to where your hem is, but add maybe 3 or 4 inches to that measurement and cut a square to those dimensions. So see how as my skirt is laid on top, you can see my paper is just a few inches larger than the hem in both directions. It doesn't have to go way out here to the edge of the fabric because that's a waste unless you did one of the longer lengths. If so, then make your paper to that size. Okay, so we basically just want to start off by marking our paper the same way that we marked our fabric before we draped it. So just looking at my first sheet right here, we're going to mark a line that will be for the center front. And what you should always do is wherever you draw center front or center back on your paper, give yourself, still do it about 2 inches in from the edge of the paper. We'll specify the exact measurement from that line later on, but that's just always a good starting amount. And going back to reviewing our paper grains, you have to be sure that this center front as well as the center back line that you draw are in the lengthwise grain direction of the paper. So that's the direction where the numbers are the same in any row. See 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3. Also, it's parallel to this edge of the paper that has the 1/4 yard markings. And I have to be sure that I'm creating these lines so that it'll work out for the right side of the body. So if this is the top of my paper, I'll come about 2 inches in from this side and draw my center front line right in the center of this row of numbers. So just right up the middle of the plus signs. Okay. And then we'll also draw the horizontal balance line 15 inches down from the top edge and square it across. So about 15, square it to my center front. Start to draw it, and then to continue, remember that you need to have a good portion of your ruler matched up to the previous line so that it continues nice and straight all the way across. Okay. And so this will end up being for my front, so I'll write CF for center front before I forget. And then now we're going to set up the back. Okay. All right, so I want to draw center back on this other far side of my paper so that it ends up on the opposite side of the center front. And just be sure again that this is the lengthwise grain direction of your paper. If it helps, I could even rotate this around so that I have that side with the little 1/4 yard markers on this side. It doesn't matter what end of the lengthwise grain is facing up, like top or bottom. It just has to be that overall direction that you draw this line in. So I'll come about 2 inches in from the edge and right in the center of this row of numbers, which are 2s, we'll draw my center back line. And then now, 15 inches down from the top, we'll square our horizontal balance line across. Okay, and then just continue the same line. Okay. All right, so that is again my CB, center back line. So I'm just gonna walk you through real quick the pinning and transfer marks just on the front only, and you'll know that it'll be the same for the back when you're ready to do it. So come back to my front. Okay, I wanna be sure to grab the correct piece of fabric that you draped your front on. Okay, and all of its marks should coordinate with what you just drew on your paper. So there's my center front fold and my horizontal balance line. And I'm just going to be pinning those marks onto my paper. Okay, and so your first set of pins, smooth this out a bit, or your first pin will always be center front meeting the horizontal balance line. Match it on your fabric to the same marks on your paper. Right there. Pin it directly to the paper. Okay, and then go ahead and add a few more pins up and down on your center front fold, making sure that it is right on the line that you drew. Okay, so I could smooth it up, and I'm just pinning a little bit above my actual waistline mark. And coming down, I think I'm going to pin it once about halfway to the hem, and then again down by the actual hem. And wherever I'm coming to like my waistline and hemline marks, I'm putting my pins outside of those marks so that the actual pattern piece on the inside of the marks will stay flat. This is always a tough one because it's a big piece and I gotta lean over. Okay, so there's center front. Now we pin our horizontal balance line. So really be sure that you're smoothing your fabric out a lot as you do this. And your horizontal balance line, you want to really force it to match the line on your paper. Maybe the blocking of your fabric got a little bit off in draping. That's just a natural occurrence. So force them to match again. And then maybe about every 6 inches or so, you could pin across your horizontal balance line. Okay, that's probably good. And then I'll come way out here and pin it once more outside of the hemline. Then just smooth outward and just at a couple more places pin outside of your hem marks. Okay, so here. And here. And then same thing in this direction. I want to smooth it up and out. And your hem marks kind of probably just drift off the side of the fabric here. I didn't have you mark where the side seam meets the hem, but no big deal. That is all going to be done in the truing process. So I'll pin a little outside that corner, and then finally up here, the side seam waist corner. Okay, once more in the middle of the side seam. There we go. And then now we just want to take the tracing wheel and copy all of the marks we have. So you want to get your cross mark at the hip level side seam. And you don't actually have to mark all the little dots of the side seam. You really just need this mark at the very top. The little cross mark where the side seam meets the waist, okay? Then along your waistline, grab the dots, and you want to kind of be lifting up your wheel and trying to just do a little roll on each dot rather than continuous, because your wheel is likely to kind of go off track. Okay. Cross mark at the center front, and remember your princess line cross mark. Get that too after you do the waistline. And then coming down here to the hem, again, don't try to true these as you're using the tracing wheel. We'll do that with our pencil. So just come to each pencil mark and mark it as you see it. Do a separate little roll for each of these dashes that create the hem. Okay, so you can go ahead and do this for both your front and your back. And then after you've marked everything with the tracing wheel, you're going to unpin your fabric, and you want to come in with your pencil. And is that a mark? Okay, I think I may have to make that up in between. You think it's a mark?
It looks like it.
Yeah, it's something. That's in kind of the right spot, so we'll give it a whirl. Okay, after you go ahead and transfer everything, then you'll unpin your fabric. Use your pencil to lightly sketch all of your marks exactly as you see them, okay? So go ahead and you can work on that until our lunch break at 2:45, and then we'll be continuing afterwards. now that we have all of our marks and everything transferred, we can start creating some of our shapes here. So first thing that I always like to do is square any of the seam lines that go into the center front or center back. So I keep kind of switching between my two sheets of paper here, but here's my front skirt. You want to square your waistline for a short distance as it meets center front. Okay. And then you'll also want to do the same with your hemline as it meets, because we don't want to have a pointed hem at the bottom. So just square a small section of the marks, okay? So you'll do that on your front skirt as well as back skirt. There's our waistline. We're gonna square it to meet center back, and then also come down and do the same thing at the hemline. Square to meet center back. Okay. Now, this is gonna be a little bit interesting here. I'm actually even changing it up from how I've done in previous classes. Normally, we would go on to our side seam and true that next, right? And that would be fine. However, our side seam waist corner mark right here, that's basically gonna establish the entire placement of the side seam. And if we were just making a circle skirt and we were maybe gonna draft a waistband, then we could leave our marks exactly as they are. But we're gonna walk your waistline seams from your midriff bodice pieces right here, okay? So since when we sew your entire dress, you're gonna be sewing the waistline of your front and back midriff onto the waistline of the skirt, we wanna make sure those seam lines walk, as well as we wanna check the accuracy of your princess line marks right here. Because in draping these two different projects, as we do the waistline, they're both on kind of different grains of the fabric and may behave a little differently. Your skirt has a little more tendency to get stretched out on some of these curves when you're draping it, whereas when we do the waistline on the bodice right here, it's on the cross grain of the fabric, which while it has a little bit of give, is still a little more stable. So what we're gonna do is walk the waistline of these pieces onto the waistline of your skirt and make any corrections to the length of the overall waistline, as well as the princess seam notch. So let's go ahead and take a look at front first, okay? So I have here my front midriff, as well as here's my waistline on the skirt. So we're gonna use that trick we learned last week of using your awl to walk the seam line. That's where we're gonna be matching the actual seam lines right here of the two pieces, and you kind of have to pivot the two pattern pieces to follow the shape that we see. However, we do wanna have a curve drawn in before we do this, because otherwise we're just walking along these little light dashed lines. So we're gonna use the hip curve to draw in our waistline shape. And where I say it's kind of different is typically we would rather create the waistline while the side seams are attached, because you know how we always want to have a nice smooth curve as we pass over the side seam. We're going to go back and make that minor correction later, but we don't want to draw in our side seams until we see if we maybe have to change the placement of it for the waistlines to walk. So I'm gonna use my hip curve and just kind of follow my dashed lines, but still kind of smoothing them out and averaging them to make a nice rounded curve. And I'm gonna turn it this way, sort of, you know, facing the majority of the group here. One thing you wanna keep in mind as you're creating your waistline is, we made our little squared mark right here, okay? No point of your waistline should drop lower than that squared line, okay? So if I were to come from here and follow the curve, it should only go up from this point. If your marks dip down a little below this squared line, kind of ignore that and take the high road and blend into them to only come up from that point. We don't want our waistline to dip down and then curve up, all right? So kind of think of this as like the lowest point of the waistline as you're looking at this curve. So I'm gonna come in from around center front first and cut a big hole in my paper, yeah. Okay, and I just wanna create a nice smooth curve up towards the side seam. Okay. All right, so now that we have our line drawn in, I'm gonna go ahead and start to walk my midriff. So we're gonna be walking the waistline seam of the midriff onto the waistline of the circle skirt. Be sure to not use that upper edge, that is the midriff style line. So I wanna just kind of look through the transparency of the paper, and it helps if you unfold that excess you have at center front. But you wanna be sure to match this exact point where the two seam lines meet to this exact point, okay? You ignore the seam allowance and you're walking the seam lines, which are also, kind of loosely called the sew lines. Okay, so I'll match them right here. And what I also wanna do is kind of come in and darken my mark for the princess line, because I wanna be able to see that through my paper and see if I need to fix anything, okay? And I also wanna have my tracing wheel handy. Okay, so I'm gonna begin to walk. I see that my seam lines are matched to about here, so I'm gonna move the awl forward and just pivot so I line up the next section and just keep kind of walking along until I'm at my princess line marks, okay? And I could see when I get up to them now that they're off by a bit, okay? So here's the mark on my bodice, and underneath for the skirt, it's maybe about 1/4 of an inch over. I'm gonna choose to trust my bodice, or the midriff piece, which is kind of all part of the bodice. I'm gonna trust this mark and make my skirt mark match that one. So to do that, we can use the tracing wheel, and this is why it's also good to have the princess line mark drawn in pencil first, because we don't wanna make another tracing wheel mark next to it and then not be able to know which one is which, okay? So we'll know that the old one is already penciled in. Okay, I wanna look through, and on my my front midriff here, I'm gonna roll over my notch marking with the tracing wheel and look underneath. Here's where it copied, okay? So I'm gonna make this be my actual princess line notch placement on the pattern. And I'm gonna erase the original one that happened while I was draping, okay? So this one right here gets erased. And now we know that our seam lengths will be the exact same from the center front up to the notch. Once you've done that though, we're gonna walk the rest of the way and see if this measurement is the same up to the side seam. And if not, we're gonna correct your skirt side seam placement to match the bodice. So let's see that. So I'm gonna match from my new notch markings and just continue walking the waistline. Okay. And as I come up to it, I'm also just gonna make sure that I can really see that little side seam cross mark on the skirt. Okay, come up to it, and yeah, it looks like we have a little bit of a minor correction to make. Here's my side seam on my midriff, and the skirt piece underneath, it's a little bit further in by like 1/8 of an inch. Because again, draping on this side part of the skirt, you're on the bias of the fabric, and it does have the tendency to stretch a little too much while you're draping, which will make your measurement a little too small. So I'm gonna take my tracing wheel and just copy the side seam on my midriff with a little cross mark, okay? And we're gonna move our side seam mark on the skirt to match it, okay? So I just transferred this mark, all right? And I'm gonna erase my old side seam mark. See, it just came out about 1/8 of an inch. And from there, I'm just gonna kind of connect it a little across to meet that mark with my hip curve. And we'll kind of compare the side seams and see if we need to smooth this little corner out when we get to the side seam portion. But now I'm good. I know that now this measurement as well as this measurement is the exact same between the midriff and the skirt, okay? So while I have the front up, because I'm doing a lot of, switching these big, large pieces of paper, let's go ahead and draw in our side seam from that mark, okay? So remember I said, okay, you can mark a couple dots on your muslin for the side seam, but really it's not gonna matter a whole lot. We did wanna have this little cross mark showing us where the hip level is, but other than that, we're gonna use our mark we have for the side seam at the waist as our main starting point for the side seam. And we're just gonna draw it in perfectly squared to center front, okay? So I'm gonna bring my L square over, And I want to match one leg of it to the center front and have the other leg coming down right through the side seam mark I have, the one that I just corrected. Okay, so there I'm at the mark, here I'm matched up to center front, and I'm just going to draw straight down. See that? So just draw it down at least to your hemline markings, okay? So even if your hemline doesn't match, it's fine, we'll work that out later, okay? So there's my side seam. And while I'm at it too, let's go ahead and add our seam allowance and cut on the line. Side seam gets how much seam allowance? Half inch, okay? So on my side seam, I'll add 1/2 inch. Okay, I'm just gonna add it all the way to the bottom just so I have kind of a line to cut my paper on. Maybe even do the same thing up to the top here. Just kind of keep cutting, even though this whole area is not gonna end up as part of our pattern. Okay. So now I'm just gonna cut the excess away on my seam allowance line. Okay, so there we go. I now have kind of my waistline and side seam done for the front skirt. And I'm just gonna let that hang out for a minute, and we're gonna do the same thing to the back, okay? So now here's back skirt, and we also need your back midriff pattern piece. So just like the front, we're gonna begin by just truing our waistline curve. And also just like the front, we wanna be sure that this squared mark you have at center back is the lowest part of the curve, that it only goes up from there, not downward at any point. So just come in with your ruler and make the smoothest curve you can across your marks. Okay, and then make sure that your side seam and princess line marks are dark enough to see them as we walk our seam next, okay? So here's back midriff. I'm gonna be walking the waistline onto the waistline of the skirt. So remember that we ignore the seam allowances, and when I walk it, it's on the actual seam lines. So I'm gonna begin from this corner right here, where the center back meets the waistline, and match it to this corner right here, okay? So there we are. And I'm first gonna walk it just up to the princess line notch, just to check those out and see how well they're matched. Okay, pretty close on this one, but just a tiny bit off. This one is maybe like a 1/16 of an inch further down. So I'm gonna use my tracing wheel to transfer the notch from the midriff onto the skirt. Okay, it'll be real close, but if I look underneath, see it did move over a tiny bit to right here instead. That's where I want my notch to be now. And I'm just gonna erase the old mark. Okay, and now we're gonna continue walking from the princess line notches to the side seam. Okay, so walk, walk, walk. Okay, how do we do here? Oh, that is right on. Okay, I can double check it by rolling over it, but yeah, my side seam marks are right on. But if yours don't match, then you want to correct your skirt to match this side seam placement. So you'll transfer the side seam through to your skirt when you get to it, if they're a little bit off. But since my mark is good, I can go ahead and draw my side seam from this point, and it's going to be a straight line squared from center back that passes through the mark we have at the waist. So I can just go about like this, match to my mark, and then just square down, and just make sure your line continues at least to your hemline marks. And now we'll add our 1/2 inch seam allowance and then trim away, okay? So just gonna, like before, I'm gonna add the seam allowance line all the way from top to bottom on the paper just so I have something nice to cut on at both ends. And we cut. Okay, so now that my side seams are both done, we're gonna go ahead and compare them, okay? So even though we've been looking at everything with center front over here, and it's always hard with the big pieces, center back over here, if you turn them like this, boom, there's both of the side seams where they would get sewn together. So I'm gonna take my usual favorite, the back, and I'm gonna fold the seam allowance under so that we can match it up to the front. I'm just really tearing at the paper today, aren't I? Okay. All right. So I'm folded. Now we're gonna bring it over, and honestly with this, there's not gonna be a big comparison of lengths to happen here. And I mean, there is, but there's no set length that we're going for. You're gonna match your side seams starting at the waist, and then we'll look down at our hem and just smoothly true past whichever of the hemlines has a nicer shape to transition into the other. There's not really big right or wrong. It's all about just getting a nice shape at the bottom, okay? So as I match from the waistline here, I want to attach the pieces together, and you can either do it through a few pins. They don't have to be super close. They could be every few inches, or, you know, my favorite, this removable tape. So I'm going to use this to hold them together, okay? Because we also have to be sure to check our truing at the waistline while we're at it. Okay, so first let's take a look at the waist. Now, we're not gonna have any problem of matching, you know, which waistline is correct. We made them match. We just wanna be sure that the waistline is smooth as it passes over the top of the side seam. And mine actually looks pretty good, but sometimes even if it just kind of looks good, it's still nice to just get in there and really like draw a line right across it. So the kind of thing that you would especially want to be sure to correct is, let's say if your waistlines come together and they look like they make a, well, that's very extreme, but if they make a little bit of a point when they come up right here, then we'll want to kind of gently shave that point off so that it's smooth as it passes, okay? It should be very, a little flat right here. But I still, even though it's pretty decent curve, I just want to bring this in and really smooth that out nicely, okay? All right, that looks good now. So now as we take a look down at our hem at the bottom, my mark's almost even kind of, let's see, I do have a little mark here. I don't even have much of my hemline marked right there. I just want to take a look, not directly at the side seam, but, you know, let your eyes gaze a little further out and imagine, okay, if I was to true across these, you know, how would I just get a smooth curve between either of these marks? That's really all you're going for. If you had your marks, let's say, you know, at the hemline and one was down here, one was up here, you could kind of clearly see that mark looks a little wrong, because it'll be much nicer if I come in right here and bring it down to blend with the bottom, okay? So that's all you're looking for as we true the hem. So I'll ignore that random stray mark I did, and you want to use your hip curve and at least just true a small portion of it as it passes the side seam, okay? We'll come back and do the whole thing in a minute. We just want to get that as a nice smooth shape. Now, the last thing that we need to check out on our side seam is this little cross mark we did at the hip level. Any dress or skirt that continues from the waistline past the hip, we need to have a notch on the pattern exactly at the hip level. So we want to be comparing these marks and truing them so that we're marking our hip level notch in the same spot on both. And when in doubt, if you're like, oh, which one of these is correct? You could see that this mark over here is like far in from the side seam, but imagine that it continued over. They're off by like a 1/16 of an inch. We're just gonna go off of measurements because the distance from the waistline to the hip level on the side seam, if you measure it on the dress form, is exactly 8 inches from here to here. So even though we make those marks for our reference, you're just gonna come up to your waistline basically and measure 8 inches down and just draw a nice firm pencil line. That's where my notch is gonna be on the seam allowance of both pieces, okay? So I have a nice clear dark mark that's 8 inches below the waist. Okay, another thing we could do while the pieces are still attached even is let's go ahead and add our seam allowance to the waistline. It's gonna be 1/2 inch, okay? So this one's a little tough because it's a very tight curve. So you want to really move your ruler frequently. Remember that your seam allowance should, I even need to, I gotta rotate my paper for this one, sorry. Your seam allowance should look like a smooth round curve. And even though you're technically creating like a series of straight lines that blend together, they should become a smooth curve. So you gotta really kind of, real short little marks. Did I say how much this seam allowance is? Or did I forget? 1/2 inch. It should be 1/2 inch. I didn't remember if I said it out loud or just thought it, so. Okay. You can just draw it right past the side seam. Oop, that's a little funky. Smooth that out. Okay. All right, okay, waistline seam allowance is done. I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect the pieces now. I think I've done everything I need to do on the side seam. We're gonna need to true the hem, but we already smoothed out the portion that passes the side seam, so they no longer need to be attached. Unfold the back seam allowance there, okay? And up at the top here, I drew that seam allowance while the pieces were separated, but you wanna be sure that your seam allowance meets the side seam allowance. So from that little point right there where the paper was overlapped before, just square the seam allowance over until it meets this edge. Do the same thing on both the front and back. Okay, just square it across. All right. So let's see. Yeah, let's go ahead and true our hem. Let's start with the front. Okay. So here we're also just going to be finding a nice pretty way to average all of these marks and make a smooth curve. But as we look at it, you know, we want to have a nice smooth rounded curve, but we still want to keep some of the subtle nuances that we get from draping. When you take pattern 1, we draft a circle skirt as well. And it is actually using kind of like a radius tool to make perfect circular arcs, which is way faster than draping a circle skirt, okay? So it's a more common way to create it. But when we drape, we get a lot more nuances in how the fabric hangs. So take a look at the shape the hem is making right about here. It looks like I have a rounded curve kind of coming in from both sides, but right in this area, it almost flattens out a bit. It's almost a little bit straight. That's because this is the part that was on the true bias when we draped it. The fabric has so much more stretch and flexibility in the true bias direction that when you're draping, it actually hangs down lower while you're marking it. But then when we take it off, it kind of retracts up a little bit. So it's gonna look like we have kind of a flat area rather than it being a perfect circle that would maybe come a little bit further out in this area. But that's kind of one of the perks of draping, is being able to capture these interesting shapes. So if you were just making like a short circle skirt for a cotton sundress, you could use the drafting method that you'll learn in pattern 1, where it's just kind of a perfect circular hem. You won't tell the difference either way. But if you're doing evening wear, bridal, anything where you're dealing with silks and fabrics that are more fluid and have drape, and you're making full-length gowns, then you'll actually get a better hem shape if you drape the skirt. And better yet, don't mark the hem until it's sat for like 24 hours. Because you let that fabric sit and hang, and the yarns will kind of adjust and fall more into their final position. So you want to let it do its hanging thing, and then you come in and mark your hem. Okay, so just a little bit of a tidbits on how the hem shape on these things works. So either way, we want to keep that sort of flatness here, and then everything else we're just kind of trying to average it into a nice rounded curve. So here's where I started over here at the side seam, you know. If you use the hip curve for this, which I'm doing just because it's a gentle curve, you want to still use kind of multiple sections of it. If I draw too much of one curve, then I'm going to have this big straight section and then a too tight of a curve. So I want to kind of keep moving it along and almost trying to use a similar portion of the curve for most of the areas. And I may see I drew that mark. I feel like if I come from there to here, it's kind of dipping up too high. So you may sort of end up correcting some of your curves as you go. See there how I ignored that little part of the line I had? Just want it smooth, round, and you may see some marks along the way, like this one here. That's a troublemaker. That one's not invited to the party. See how it's way higher than this one and this one? So as we come past, we're gonna go higher than that mark, all right? So follow the majority of the marks, but if there is one that looks what is, yeah, I'm having a moment here with the tearing the paper. Okay, pencil is better pulled, not pushed. Okay, so here's where I was saying there's that one odd mark that doesn't belong. We're ignoring him. Okay, and here that kind of dips up a little bit too much, so I'm gonna kind of take the low road with these ones. Maybe I'm turning the ruler this way. And then I want to blend right into my squared line, and just like the waist, this should be the lowest point of this curve. You don't want your hemline to dip any lower than that squared line and come up to meet it. If we go from here, it should only go up from that point. So just take note of that as you go to meet it. There we go, okay? So there's my hem shape, and if you get like an aggressive paper moment like I did, you want to fix it with some tape. So you just come back in and put some tape over that. Sort of a Band-Aid. Okay, so while we're at it, we're gonna add our hem allowance to this before I switch over and do the same thing on the back. And most of the time, a standard hem allowance, like when in doubt, is to add 1 inch to the hem. But we're not gonna do 1 inch. We are only gonna do 1/2 inch for our hem allowance. And you'll usually want to choose 1/2 inch for the hem if the hem has a very deep curve to it. If we're doing like a straight hem, like when we did basic skirt, we gave it 1 inch because it's really easy to fold up 1 inch and have it be nice and crisp. But when it's curved like this, it's really difficult or near impossible to fold up a wide hem without it kind of buckling and puckering. If you remember back to industry sewing, when you sewed your casual shirt with that curved shirt tail hemline, that only had 1/2 inch hem allowance, but you remember that was still a little hard on some of the curves. So imagine if the hem allowance was wider, it would kind of be impossible to get a nice hem. So we're treating this kind of like that shirt tail hem, and we only want 1/2 inch. So I'm just gonna add my 1/2 inch all along. Okay. All right, so there's my hem allowance. And yeah, let's go ahead and switch over and do the same thing to the back. Just gonna through the hem and add the hem allowance. Okay, there's my side seam. So I already see where my hem needs to begin from the center back. I want to only come up from that mark. Don't let it dip down. Just kind of average the marks. That one dips a little low, so I may curve up a little higher to blend with the other marks better. You even have to back it up a little bit to blend with that curve. Sometimes you'll need to do that. You'll start off in one direction and realize, oh, got to go backwards a little bit to make things blend nicely. Okay, see, I ignored that mark. That's a troublemaker. Okay, and then we just want to end at the little portion that we already had at the side seam. Woo! Now hem allowance, 1/2 inch on the whole thing, just like we did on the front. Okay. All right, so I've got my hem allowance on everything. Now we just kind of have to discuss how much seam allowance do we need on the only seams that don't have it yet, which are our center back and center front. See, we've already got it on waist, side seam, hem. So at your center back, you are going to give 1 inch seam allowance because that's how much we did on our back midriff and back bodice, okay? So we'll have the same 1 inch extension that's used to sew in a zipper. Okay, so I'll add 1 inch. And at the bottom and the top, you just want to square your waistline seam allowance and hem allowance over to meet the line that we just drew. So right up here, square it over to meet, okay? And same thing at the hem, just square over to meet, all right? Okay, that's our back. Now for the front, we have an interesting predicament to discuss with the front. All right, so on our front bodice and midriff, when we draped it, we said that those pieces were going to be on the fold, right? As in we didn't want to have a seam in the center front. It's just going to mirror across to the other side with no seam. But on our skirt, if we were to use this center front line and say, this is going to be on the fold, depending on the length of your skirt, odds are this would not be able to fit on the width of the fabric when you cut it, okay? So that's a thing to always keep in mind with a really full skirted pattern. When this gets cut on the fabric, the center front line right here that would be on the fold in theory, that needs to be in the lengthwise grain direction of the fabric, which means that from this point all the way down here to the side seam, if this measurement is larger than half the width of my fabric, then this won't fit all the way across the width to the other side, okay? So yeah, imagine that my fabric width, if this is right in the center of it, my 2 selvages are coming down this side, down these sides, okay? And the piece has to be in this direction. We can't turn it or the grain will be incorrect. So when it's sitting this way, my fabric has to be at least twice as wide as my center front fold line to the hem over here, if I want it to be on the fold, okay? So ways to work around that, we're gonna take the simplest approach today, which is we are going to add a seam to the center front right here. We're just gonna add 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then this would be cut as 2 separate pieces where we know they'd be able to fit across the width of the fabric, okay? Other ways that you could learn later on are you could create a seam from the princess lines instead, which would sometimes, in my opinion, be a lot more aesthetically pleasing. Center front seam, granted, is kind of ugly, but we're doing it for the sake of logistics here, as well as to be able to have this conversation, okay? So you're gonna come to your center front and only add 1/2 inch seam allowance. It'll just be sewn like a regular old plain seam. It will not be on the fold, even though your front bodice pieces are. And then at the top and bottom, I'm just gonna square that seam allowance to meet the seam allowance at the waistline and the hemline, okay? All right, so at this point, my skirts are basically drafted. We just need to cut them out and add the notches and the seam allowances, okay? So I'm gonna give you all a little bit of time to work so you don't have to sit up here and watch me cut, but I will be cutting out both of these pattern pieces. Okay, so I'm just gonna be going over the labeling and notching of our pattern, which should be really quick, but then I also wanna be sure that I can show you a cutting demonstration and give you a little bit of the rundown of how you're gonna be sewing your dress. So, first off, let's get our notches onto this pattern now, okay? So, first thing we wanna do is you're going to place notches at the top and bottom of your center front seam, okay? That's where we had our 1/2 inch seam allowance. And we're gonna be notching just straight up and down in line with the seam line at both ends. So these notches are just facing each other, top and bottom, okay? And we're also gonna do the same thing on the center back, which is the one that has the 1 inch seam allowance, but you're still gonna place the same notches at the top and bottom of the center back line as your indicator of the fact that there is 1 inch on the back to add a zipper, all right? Next, we always want to have notches at the top and bottom of our side seam. However, we're going to do a little bit something different with these because whenever we have a bodice, we notch both ends of the side seam, right? So they're kind of facing each other. We do that if the bottom end of the piece is also going to get sewn onto something else, like on a bodice when we're going to sew a skirt or a peplum on. If the bottom of your side seam finishes with a hem where you're actually just going to be folding the fabric up to finish it rather than sewing something else across it, then we do something different at the bottom. So at the top of the side seam, you're going to notch in the direction of the side seam, okay? So it's going downward, saying sew me in this direction on the side seam. But at the bottom, when we have a hem, we choose instead to indicate the hem allowance with our notch at this corner. So rather than going in the side seam direction, it's gonna go in the hem allowance direction. So that when you fold your hem up, you will fold it where the notch is and you know, oh, that's how much hem allowance I have. So these notches go sideways in line with your finished hemline, okay? All right. And of course, we gotta come in and create our notch that's right here at the hip level on the side seam. This is the one that we just kind of corrected our marks to make sure that it's exactly 8 inches down from the waist. And here's another cool trick. If we wanna make sure that that notch is exact, even placement on both pieces, we're gonna match them up and notch them together, okay? So I'm gonna align my side seams from the top to the bottom. And here I could see where I made my darker pencil mark, exactly where I want the notch to be. Okay, it's right there. I'm gonna mark the notch out at the seam allowance, and I'm just gonna clip it through both layers of paper, assuming that they are nicely matched, and then we get perfect hip level notches. That would be the exact same on both pieces, okay? Next, you're gonna come to your princess line notches. Okay, these are those ones that we corrected to match the bodice. So you just want to look at where they are on the seam line and bring them straight out to the seam allowance. Even though it's a curve, imagine that you're squaring that notch mark out, okay? So So both of those, princess line notch. Okay. What else? What else? I think this is last, but certainly not least. On the center back seam right here, where you have your 1-inch seam allowance, we need a notch to indicate where the bottom of a zipper will go, okay? And we also want to be sure that we somehow indicate that this pattern piece is for the back of the body. Now, we didn't really do anything like this on our bodice that we just created, the waist midriff bodice, but usually any pattern piece that belongs to the back needs to have a double notch somewhere on it. A double notch is basically 2 notches that are placed exactly 1/2 inch apart. And anytime you see a double notch on a pattern piece, you know, oh, that's the back. So usually other places you'll see them are midway on the armhole of a bodice. The front bodice will have a single notch on the armhole, and the back bodice will have a double notch on the armhole. So you could always see that double notch and go, oh, that's the back. So we're going to be placing a double notch on our center back seam at the point that we want our zipper to end, okay? And that position is going to be at hip level, which, hey, that's where your horizontal balance line is drawn right here. So this is one thing that I always like to make sure you all know from the start. Like, even if a lot of these other details you kind of gloss over as you move on with stuff, always remember that when you are putting a zipper into a skirt or a dress, the bottom of the zipper has to be all the way down to the hip level, or else nobody will be able to get into that garment. If it stops short, you can't get the round part of your booty through the dress, period. Because the hip is the widest part of the body. So if the garment doesn't open up enough to that largest part, you're not gonna be able to get into it, all right? So always remember that. So we're gonna come down here to where we have our good old HBL, which is also the hip level. And straight across from it, I'm gonna use my ruler to help me with this. I'm gonna extend that over to the edge of the seam allowance and place 1 notch right there. And then to make it our double notch, the other notch has to be exactly 1/2 inch away, and you're going to mark it 1/2 inch above the first notch. So you'll have one exactly at the hip level and another 1/2 inch above it. So I'll use my ruler and measure exactly 1/2 inch up from the first notch. And when I'm measuring, I measure from the exact center of the notch cutout, just for reference, okay? Just like that. So that double notch will always say, hey, I'm the back of the skirt, and also zipper must be sewn down to this point. And then it's a closed seam below that, right? Okay, so that's actually pretty easy. Got our notches done. Now we're just gonna label these, and then we gotta do a little overview of our cutting and sewing. So, first off, let's go ahead and give everybody a grain line. Your grain lines will be drawn 1 inch away from center front and center back. So that's always pretty standard on any pattern piece where part of it includes the center front or center back. So again, not from the seam allowance, but from your actual seam line, the true center front position. I'm 1 inch away, and draw a nice long grain line. And then on back skirt, same thing, 1 inch in from the center back line. Okay. Now our piece information, this is all going to be pretty straightforward. Remember, this can be either parallel or perpendicular to your grain line, just not at a weird angle, and it should be close to your grain line. I didn't take points off on it this time, but some of you on your bodices or midriffs, I still saw the information written kind of way over here. So have it right nice and tight next to the grain line. So all your info is kind of in one spot. So I'm gonna go parallel today. This is my front skirt. So the piece name is front skirt, okay? And next you will write size 8. Then we do the cut number, and our front skirt, remember, is a cut 2. Our pieces are probably going to be wide enough that we need to add that center front seam, so you need to cut a separate left and right. And lastly, your name. Okay. And now for the back skirt, it's going to be very similar, except it will say back skirt instead, basically. So parallel to my grain line, I will write back skirt, size 8, cut 2 also, and your name. And remember, this all needs to be in black pen, your grain line and your piece information. Okay, so there we go. There's our completed pattern.